Everywhere we would go, people would say, well, he was weird. He was a weird guy. And it was like, he was a genius. Geniuses are weird. They're like artists.
18, 19, 20-year-olds. They dream of travel, dream of finding their place, dream of making their mark on the world. This spring, a group of students will follow their dreams, walking in the footsteps of the most famous figure in their field, traveling to another continent and making unexpected connections between his legacy and their own lives and futures.
I first heard of Isaac Newton from maybe kindergarten. Like teacher would talk about how an apple fell down to the ground and then Newton discovered gravity.
An apple falling from a tree. A simple story, but one that has become the most remembered about Sir Isaac Newton. That legend can't begin to describe the immensity and the diversity of Newton's discoveries.
So that means everything's true, everything's false?
During spring term in England, this group of Hanover College students will trace Newton's life. Math professor Nancy Rogers will lead them to the question, what can be learned in following in the footsteps of one of the most intelligent human beings of all times?
Newton is especially fascinating to us because he's a liberal arts person and we're a liberal arts college. Not only was he a physicist and mathematician, he was also an astronomer, a dedicated historian and theologian, and alchemist, and he was also a civil servant and economist. And the 7 students in my math history class have a combination of interest and double majors in math that connect with Newton's wide range of interests. Rusty Jones is a freshman math major, and he's very excited about the trip because he knows he'll be able to use it in his future career.
Whenever I plan to teach math in high school, I want to be able to convey the ideas of Newton and maybe give them a better appreciation because math isn't always enjoyed by students in high school.
Jason Dorman is a sophomore math major and a farmer. He's also going to teach math in high school.
The one reason that I didn't want to go on this trip was this is the busiest time of the year for my family at home with my dad being on the farm. But he said he could manage it on his own this year. I feel bad leaving him with all the work to do by himself, but he's more than capable.
Like Newton, Lauren Brown, who's a junior math major, also has a deep interest in theology. And over Christmas break, she organized a mission trip to Haiti to work in orphanage with children there.
Newton was actually more interested in theology than science and math from the number of papers that he wrote. Theology is very important in my life, and so it kind of helps me relate to him a little better to see that you can study both theology and math.
Michael Sobchak is a double major in math and philosophy, and Newton was also a natural philosopher. And Michael also has a black belt in martial arts, which uses Newton's principles constantly.
Anytime there is an object in motion, or a collision, or any type of interaction between objects, Newton's laws of motion will be involved.
Jetchi Wang is a double major in math and chemistry, and she plans to do research in chemistry, so she's especially interested in Newton's explorations in alchemy.
The origins of this notion that you would have sort of vegetative chemistry comes from the absolute beginnings of alchemy.
We are going to Newton's farm. I was thinking if I were there and walk around, if I could just hit by apple or something like that, or just hit by some genius idea and publish a paper. But I don't know if that's possible or not, but that would be cool if it happens.
Wesley Huff is a junior double major in math and economics, so he's interested in Newton's work with the Royal Mint.
In all the history of economics, the two most important people are Adam Smith, and he was in the Revolutionary time, 1776, he published The Wealth of Nations. And he is quoted or has been sourced to say that Newton was one of his inspirations, the way that Newton would doggedly study something.
Mr. Newton would be proud to see that his telescope is the #1 design.
Wade Pierson is a senior physics major and math minor, and next year he's going to graduate school in engineering at Wright State University.
So, a light collector, a magnifier, that kind of thing.
I was interested in studying optics, especially Newton's contributions, because of his revolutionary design for his telescope. Learning in the places that Newton studied will be pretty powerful because really it's going to be walking in the footsteps of a giant.
We started out in Grantham, which is Newton's birthplace and boyhood home, and where he actually did a good portion of his physics work and development of calculus.
It was cool to see kind of where his humble beginnings were as a farmer. Find that connection with him, kind of, oh, okay, he was a farm boy as well.
There's a lot of different barns that they use for different things, some for the animals, some for storage, some for grain. So it was obviously a very big farm.
Newton was born prematurely in his mother's bedroom in 1642. His early years were marked by tragedy and loss. His father had died 3 months before his birth. Baby Isaac was not expected to live. At age 3, his mother abandoned him. She married a vicar who didn't want the toddler in his house, and so Newton was left at Woolsthorpe with his grandmother.
I guess being in his room it felt very authentic, to say the least. The rumpled bed, even the cat running around and sleeping on the bed. It felt very real and very raw and old. Kind of give a sense of really how long ago it was that he came up with his laws of motion and started his endeavors in physics and mathematics.
I've always been curious about how little Newton, a little schoolboy, would come up with all those questions that we took for granted. Like, gravity was always there, and we don't know why he was the first one who questioned why apples fell down, not other directions.
What was surprising about his house that I didn't expect to see was he had written out a list of sins that he had committed, and in the same room where he was doing all of his scientific experiments. And so to see what he thought was important in his life and what he should and shouldn't be doing.
Less than a half mile down the road is the parish church, which dates back to Saxon times, where Isaac was baptized and his parents are buried.
I don't think very many people realize how important religion was to Newton. I think everyone focuses on his notion of gravity and they kind of forget about all of the other things that he did. That Newton's faith could have played a big part in his search for finding order in the world and finding truth, because if he believed that God had created the world, it would make very logical sense to try to figure out how the world runs.
Even at a young age, Newton showed a fascination with the effect of the heavens on the earth. A popular attraction at the church, graffiti, a sundial, carved by 9-year-old Isaac in stone.
He loved sundials and watching the sun, and even in his later years in London, he would walk into a room and look at the shadows and he could tell you the time of day.
Another place to find Newton graffiti, his old school in the town of Grantham.
The library just used to be the school itself. Being in there and seeing his signature carved into the stone, it's hard to come up with the words that I felt while looking at all of that and thinking, here I am in England and Newton is all around me.
Although Isaac was a bright boy, school would have been another rough start in life. Isaac was 12 when he began at King's School. Most boys came at age 8 or 9 and left by the time they were 15.
Well, obviously he was at this school. Yeah.
Yet modern-day King's School pupils credit Isaac's difficulties with fueling his ambitions. They've even written a book of his life, which they presented to Hanover students.
It's actually quite an incident that was quite famous, and where he had a fight with the schoolmaster's son in the churchyard.
Took him over to the churchyard and rubbed his face in the church wall, which said to the bully that he was a coward. But he came back the next day and they were all sat in lines on the table, and whoever was closest to the schoolmaster was higher up, like how clever they were, and Isaac was behind the bully. So from that day onwards he decided he'd try and do as much research as possible so he would be further up the table from the bully, and that's what really started it off for him.
And then he was never beaten in academics again.
The boy's many stories make a young Newton reel for these American pilgrims, as does seeing his notebooks and writings. Here's an inattentive scholar, but a boy full of curiosity. The chairwoman of King's School Parent-Teacher Association fleshes out the boy's character.
But he was constantly doing experiments with all different things. And he seemed as though that was his interest to try and work out how things happened, or you know, how to make models, and he was always very interested in that aspect. He made a lantern fastened to a kite, but the neighbours complained about it because they were frightened that it would fall on their roofs and set their houses on fire.
As a little kid, I loved to tinker. I mean, he loved to tinker. He was making windmills and sundials and all this. I was building mini steam engines in my basement.
There are a lot of original features in Grantham that are still here today that were here when Newton attended the school. The house where he lived was next to the George Hotel, which is still there. There's obviously St Wulfings Church, which was there during his time. And there's a couple of pubs which are nearby, which were there when Newton was here.
While at school, Isaac lodged in town with William Clark, an apothecary and an alchemist.
He obviously would perform experiments which Newton was very interested in.
A precursor to chemistry, alchemy involves searching for a means to create the philosopher's stone, a material that could turn metals to gold and bring youth, purity, and immortality to its user.
Alchemy was kind of a secret thing. It's not something that people talk about.
I mean, who would have thought that a man of science would have kind of trifled in alchemy, which everyone claims and talks about as being a pseudoscience. But to him it was more of a real science, experimenting along those lines, and pursuing his philosopher's stone, which kind of fell more into his theological background, aiming for moral excellence and the pursuit of immortality, really.
It was said that the philosopher's stone could only be made by a person free of sin, and so for Newton, alchemy was another facet of his biblical studies.
So he wanted to find the truth within the world, whereas the church was simply dealing with spiritual aspects. So I think that he wanted them to go farther than they were going. They weren't explaining the world. They were just saying that God created it, and Newton thought that there was more to it than that God had created it to work in a certain way as well.
Just across the street from the King's School is the beautiful St. Wulfings Church. When it was built back in the 1300s, it was the tallest building in all of England. And of special importance to the young Isaac was the chain library upstairs, where he would go and read.
Just walking in that church and seeing, the extremely vaulted ceilings and all the stained glass and woodwork, it was quite awe-inspiring. And the little library up in the church was really an interesting experience. There were so many old books there, and it was awesome that we were able to actually take a few of them off the shelves and flip through, obviously very, very carefully. These books were, some were printed back in 1700s, 1600s, ancient books, a couple first and second editions.
Since Newton was highly interested in theology, he would come up here and read about different theological ideas and from some of the other writers. For example, this book right here is a second printing of the first edition of the King James Bible, and this page right here is the first page of the New Testament, and it has a printing date of 1613, which was 29 years before Newton was born.
Right now I'm in the crypt of St. Wulfings Church, and I heard of Newton's contributions to physics, the Newton's 3 laws, especially the third law, opposite and equal force. And then we actually apply that theory in more of a moral way, because you do something good to someone else and then they will return.
By the time Newton finished King's School at age 17, he was the star pupil and well prepared for university at Cambridge. But Grantham and Woolsthorpe play much more of a role in Newton's career than that of his boyhood home.
When Isaac graduated from Trinity College, Cambridge was shut down because of the plague, and so he had to return back to Woolsthorpe. He had barely graduated with only a second-class degree, and I doubt that anyone at Trinity ever expected to hear from him again. But his 2 years back at Woolsthorpe had been described as the greatest achievement of a human intellect in a short period of time. During these 2 years back here, he extended the binomial theorem, he invented calculus, he discovered the universal law of gravitation, and in his spare time, he figured out that white light is composed of all colors. And all of this before he was 25 years old.
It was almost a physics pilgrimage, if you will, going to the place where he really experimented and learned more about optics, especially his experiments with the light beam refraction.
Through a slit in his bedroom window, Newton separated the colors in a beam of light, while outside his apple orchard provided the legendary inspiration for the laws of gravity.
He became inspired about gravity, which his mom, she's like, it's the way it's been, it's the way it's always been. I don't see why you're thinking about this, but he kept having to prove to himself.
Nice to see, a relative of the famed apple tree that apparently inspired his notion of gravity.
Within the Woolsthorpe Manor today, visitors to the Science Discovery Museum can try out some of Newton's boyhood physics experiments. After 5 years at school, lodging with the alchemist, living for experiments and discoveries, Newton's mother called him back home.
And he came back to help on the farm, but clearly his heart wasn't in it.
For a long time I didn't want to carry on the farm because I didn't see the practicality in it with the money and the economics of the situation. But at the same time, I have a natural love for it. And I think that was something that Newton didn't have. He didn't have an attachment because he didn't have his father with him, doing it with him. It's kind of like a team thing. And I really love it, and that's because I love doing it with my father, and we have a lot of fun doing it together. And I don't think Newton ever had that as a kid.
So his mother's uncle persuaded his mother to send him back to school, which he did, for another 6 months until he moved on to Trinity College in Cambridge.
I guess we're kind of in the same boat, coming from being a farm boy that was homeschooled and then going into college, which is a different experience, but one that I quickly adapted to. It sounds like he adapted to it really quickly as well.
And you walk past that gate and the gate closes and there's just this silence. And it's really weird because this town's bustling on the other side, but then there's this quiet, and I was like, you can feel the history. It's just sitting there and you can feel it.
Cambridge University, with a history dating back to the 13th century, is one of the oldest universities in the world. When Isaac Newton enrolled in Cambridge's Trinity College in 1661, he came disadvantaged, with only a limited knowledge of mathematics. During his first term, he He bought a book on astrology, but he found he could not understand it because of the math. So he bought Euclid's Elements and Descartes' Geometry, and within a couple of years he had taught himself all the mathematics from the ancient Greeks to his own time.
Newton lived in the apartment just to the left of the Great Gate, where he often worked around the clock. He would focus on a problem and become completely absorbed by it until he had found a solution, and then he would move on to something else.
We did get to go into Newton's old laboratory, which is interesting, because it actually had a view of the bowling green. So he probably was, watching people bowl while, doing his alchemy experiments or whatever he was doing at the time. Saying, oh, these guys are, wasting their time. Well, okay, I'm just going to stay here and do my experiments. Who knows?
An artist and a genius, there's a social thing. They can't communicate with people the same way as the average person, so they throw themselves into their work because that's their way of getting their emotional outlet, their intellectual outlet.
I really want to do research. They're just giving me the impression you have to work hard.
I was most inspired by his mathematics and just the power with which he attacked all of those problems, and that he was going into areas that hadn't been discovered before.
I didn't really know he developed calculus and stuff. We don't call the calculus Newton's calculus, as we call physics like Newton's law.
What Newton did in his development of the calculus was figure out how to handle the infinitely small and the infinitely large. And without calculus, we would not have had the Industrial Revolution nor any of the amazing technology that we have today.
The Wren Library was constructed during Newton's time as university faculty. Now it contains some of his greatest works.
In 1684, Edmund Halley, who discovered the famous comet, traveled to Cambridge to ask Newton for help on solving the problem of why planets travel in elliptic orbits about the sun. And Newton told him that he had already solved the problem. When Halley read his 9-page paper, he knew that this would cause a scientific revolution. Newton didn't want to publish his work, but Halley urged him to and offered to pay for it. So finally, Newton settled down and submerged himself for the next 2 years in organizing all the work he had done for the past 20 years on celestial mechanics. And 2 years later, the Principia was published.
They actually had a first edition open there in one of the displays. It was fantastic. They also had a letter that Newton wrote to Robert Hooke, which was an early proof of the law of gravity, except it was wrong. He actually got it wrong. The way he had the diagram, the ball was actually spiraling instead of falling straight. The belief is that actually kind of inspired him to go back and really write the Principia and hammer down his laws of motion.
I say we go this way.
Punting on the river is probably one of my favorite memories. Just because, going through, Trinity College and, under so many really cool stone bridges and all that.
Careful!
Took a little while to get the steering down on those boats on the punting, because, all you have is this really long stick and not a rudder.
As the Hanover students glide along the River Cam, they get a chance to put into practice the laws of motion for which Newton is so famous, such as an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. It's hard to avoid the occasional crash when you don't have brakes.
In punting, there's the whole equal and opposite reaction thing, because to do it, you push down on that big long stick, and that's you pushing against basically the bottom of the canal bed, and then the canal bed pushes on the bottom of the stick and it pushes on you, and there's the friction between your feet and the boat, and that winds up propelling you forward. No matter what you're doing, you're generally doing Newton.
Because Newton devoted so much study to his faith, following in Newton's footsteps means visiting Cambridge churches. At Great St. Mary's Church, a hike up the 123-foot medieval bell tower gives students a view of the entire city. While evensong service at King's College Chapel provides students with a sense of the traditional Anglican service. And at the Round Church, students learn how devotion to God forms the basis of the scientific quest to understand His creation.
In his theological research, Newton became convinced that the concept of the Trinity was made up by the early Catholic Church, probably around the 3rd century. And this was a serious problem because he was working at Trinity College.
I don't actually agree with some of the things that he said as far as his religious beliefs, but it was very interesting to see that he wasn't just following the norm, he was going out there and trying to discover it for himself.
The big thing about the scientific revolution is, why did it take place in Europe? Early in the Middle Ages, one could argue that China and India and the Middle East were ahead of Europe in science. So different from the Christian worldview in which God is separate from His creation, in which He has made us in a way that's like Him to understand His creation, and that it's okay to do so.
The thing I really took away was how much Christianity spurred the development of the city, not only enabled but really pushed ahead the sciences and the mathematics. And you look at the buildings, some of the buildings here, the churches, they just blow you away with the architecture here and the way that people built those to glorify God and how much He meant to them to go through all the work and all that.
Going to the service, even though it was in Latin, that's how they used to do it. So that was really neat. And my church is rather traditional too, so I actually recognized a lot of the service. And to know where that comes from and the history of that, I really enjoyed being able to experience that.
He always wanted to find a combination and a way to combine the natural world and the God and stuff.
Newton had a very analytical mind, and so when he was reading through the Bible passages and found that there were codes, I think that he was very intrigued by the fact that there were all of these puzzles to be worked out within the Bible, and so he spent a lot of time looking into prophecies and trying to figure out when all of these things would happen. So he actually decided that the world is going to end in 2060, so I guess we'll find out if he was right.
Newton's own world began to open up on his return to Cambridge as a Trinity Fellow. Today, a cutting of his famous apple tree grows outside what once were Newton's quarters. During these years, Newton continued his studies on the nature of light. He found the colors inherent in light distorted the images and accuracy of telescopes, so he invented a new reflecting telescope. This revolutionary invention earned him election to the Fellowship of the Royal Society, ranking him among the most eminent scientists in the kingdom.
He did all of his work with mirrors instead of lenses, which reduced the tendency to have a prism effect at the edge of each lens and gave a much sharper image.
Newton's success brought him reward. He was granted a professorship, a permanent place at Cambridge. Of course, the fun of a university isn't all stodgy professors and ancient texts. As the visiting Americans come across Cambridge students performing their own after-breakfast experiment, how far will toast travel when thrown off a bridge? Newton himself had a reputation for not being particularly social. Almost a recluse for 3 decades in residence at Trinity. That changed in 1689, when the genius professor was called upon to serve his new government in London.
Because he had pursued this moral excellence, now it was his turn to help the world pursue its moral excellence.
We went to Grantham, which is a small town, and then we get to move to Cambridge, which is a little bit bigger, but still kind of a quiet setting. And then we got to go to London, which is very busy. And so it's kind of exciting to see where Newton lived and the different atmospheres that he was able to experience.
After the publication of the Principia, Newton's fame grew, and along with it, his self-confidence. And he began for the first time to speak out on issues of concern. And in 1688, his colleagues elected him to represent them in the Parliament in London.
The Hanover students find a city filled with mementos of Newton's presence. Newton, the renowned intellectual, the government representative, a leading national figure, and then civil servant, as Newton is awarded the post of Warden of the Royal Mint, which was then housed in the Tower of London.
There was an entire floor in the central tower that was devoted to the Royal Mint and the different government offices that had been there.
He worked as obsessively and as hard on reorganizing the mint as he had done on math, physics, alchemy, theology, and all the other things. And he completely changed it and helped to stabilize the economy because the currency was in danger of being devalued.
He came up with the idea of the milled edges or the little lines on the edge so that way you would know if it's been cut off. An American coin, such as the quarter and the dime, we have that same thing, and so it's just kind of interesting that one of Newton's many ideas made it all the way across the sea.
And in 1705, he was awarded for his efforts by being knighted by Queen Anne.
He was the master of the Royal Mint. He used to dress up as a commoner and he'd go down to the local pubs and just listen for anybody talking about counterfeiting, and he had the authority to arrest them right there on the spot. And since counterfeiting was an act of high treason, it was punishable by being drawn and quartered. And so it would be one of these, the detective goes and he rips off his cloak and goes, "I am Isaac Newton and you are, guilty of crimes against the crown," and all that jazz. And so I thought that was kind of cool.
In order to develop our understanding of how mathematics had developed up into Newton's time, we spent 2 days at the British Museum, and each student researched a different culture and the contributions that they had made.
The British Museum is amazing. There's so much history there. They have history from the entire world. It goes back thousands and thousands of years. My project was the Egyptians, and so I got to go look at some of their hieroglyphics, and we were studying their math system. They actually only had whole numbers that they used, and then they had unit fractions, so they only had like 1/2, 1/3. So it was rather primitive math, and the Rosetta Stone is what actually allowed them to translate the hieroglyphs and figure out what they mean. And so now you can go around and you can look at the hieroglyphs and you can actually find some numbers that they've carved into the stone.
Really the most interesting thing that I found in there was an ancient Mesopotamian tablet. I think it was from around 3000 BC, which had mathematics on it. It was describing how to divide up a certain amount of rations between some workers. The most interesting thing about that tablet was the fact that I had actually read about it in one of my textbooks. So I'd actually read about it and then go and actually find the actual tablet and see the mathematics that were taking place, which was quite revolutionary at the time. Everything they did was for practical purpose. It was driven from a necessity. It's a necessity to calculate, the number of rations, the number of ships coming in.
In the Europe room for around the 16th century, I found a miniature bust of Newton next to a medallion of Christopher Wren, who built the Wren Library that we visited in Cambridge at Trinity College.
All our stuffs are just come from the old people. So you really appreciate how much effort they have done to make whatever the research I can do today possible.
So many civilizations rose and fell and pursued mathematics to a great extent. I mean, solving quadratic equations and cubes and all these equations that give us a little bit of trouble today. Yet they solved them with no calculators. Reading a book is fantastic, but actually seeing what it is, really, you can't really put a price on that.
The final step in tracing Newton's life means a pilgrimage to Westminster Abbey. For 1,000 years, the coronation site of kings and the burial place of England's great.
When we went to Westminster and we got to actually go to see his tomb and to actually go behind the red tape and to touch his casket and see where he was buried, that was probably the most surreal moment.
Standing there and knowing that there was so much history and so many people that had come before us.
He really worked his way up in society from starting out very low, and he worked his way all the way up to the top, because that's where all the kings and queens are all buried. So to see that in his gravestone it's very large and in a very prominent position within the Abbey.
For the Hanover College students, it's a place to reflect upon mortality and upon making their own mark on history. To realize that studying Newton is not to study physics or math, theology, economics, or chemistry, but to study the connections between them all and the material as method of the divine.
My favorite part was definitely actually being able to touch it, looking, because it had descriptions of all the different things that he did, from optics to alchemy to working in the Royal Mint.
There are the telescope, the coins, and it's just all the stuff he has done, and then you really appreciate he is such a genius. He has done so much in this world, and this world is not going to be the way it is without him.
He didn't just have a set of axioms and assume that everything about the world could be derived from there. He actually tried to see what happens in the world.
Which could be considered that he'd finally found the Philosopher's Stone, because it did change the world and it gave him immortality.
But when we visit all the places that he lived and that he was working at, then you kind of get to see that human side of him and see that he's kind of just like everyone else. I mean, he's a genius, but the fact that he's not so much different and he struggles with some of the same things, and he wasn't sure of himself and his work, he was just like the rest of us.
The trip to England has definitely inspired me. I've always loved math, and now that I've been here and I've learned even more than I thought I could, and seeing all of this, not both math and just history itself, like live, in person, that just makes me want to learn even more and see even more, back at home and around the world.
The whole trip we surrounded ourselves with works of great people when we went to the museums, and all the great pieces of literature that we saw dating back to the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, and all the great instruments that were made to discover all this math. And it did really make me sit down and wonder, these people were just like me. They were just human beings, and they had far less resources when they came up with their ideas than we have now. I think it gave me some more motivation to keep working, to keep seeing what I can achieve. I can certainly put more work and try and reach a higher bar than maybe I thought I could before the trip.
Oh my gosh, I can't even begin to talk about England. I get too excited. Basically, I was surprised at how different the culture was. We went there to do this documentary on the students, and I think I was learning while learning. It's just like a continuous process. Aside from learning all of the documentary stuff, like being thrown in, just having a camera, going out and doing everything, I just learned so much about the history of England, getting along with people, just too much to even start.
The weary travelers are resting now. 1 hour too many on the long road.
To go somewhere and experience it really adds to your liberal arts education. It really helps complete you as a person, as a student.
She may not sleep, but she will know where we are going. And me, your diligent host for the trip.
It's highly important to go abroad and experience another culture so you can better understand the world and how it works.
It's real tight up here. It's tight, okay. Go on.
We had to be there on the production crew, and then afterwards, if I was the producer, I had to go over and make sure I had everything, and then I had much more responsibility with this than I had ever had before, so it was both intimidating and exciting.
I'm nervous. You try it first.
Just had lunch at the Eagle. It's terrific. We're feeling great. Ready to do some filming again.
I think they should make it a requirement to take a study abroad class at Hanover when you come here. It opens you up to so many different cultural differences that are so vital to anyone of any major. Not just as a communication major, how to communicate with people from different backgrounds, not even just from a different part of the country, different part of the world.
It was a really good experience, being out of our comfort zone when we were, on the streets and whatnot. It was a little bit nerve-wracking. I felt a little bit of pressure, to get exactly what we were looking for, trying to get constant, excellent footage so we had something to work with later on.
It was a little bit more of a culture shock than I thought it would be. Even I was like, okay, they still speak English. How much is it going to be different?
When we got to London, there were just people everywhere, different cultures, different food, sounds, and it was just insane for me. And then when we got in the London Eye and saw all of it from up there, I was just kind of like looking out the window like, oh.
I think if you're going to start doing a documentary, why not do it at Westminster Abbey, Shooting in Cambridge University, it was just amazing. You kind of are like a fly on the wall, and you're getting to see these people experience these like amazing things. I can't even put into words how amazing it was.